The earth convulses at 3:27 in the afternoon. Deep beneath the rolling hills of northern China's Liaoning province, in the labyrinthine tunnels of Bengzi coal mine, 1,400 tons of coal dust ignites in a fraction of a second. The explosion does not roar, it screams. A supersonic shockwave tears through 17 kilometers of underground galleries, compressing air to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Men working at the coalface feel their lungs collapse before they hear the sound. The blast wave travels faster than nerve signals, faster than thought itself. Support timbers thicker than a man's torso shatter into splinters. Steel rails twist like ribbon. The concussive force liquefies internal organs, ruptures eardrums, turns bone to powder. Within 8 seconds, every electric light in the mine goes dark. Within 12 seconds, the secondary explosion begins. Methane pockets ignited by the initial blast create a rolling fireball that chases fleeing miners through escape routes now choked with debris. The date is April 26, 1942. When rescue teams finally reach the deepest galleries 4 days later, they find 312 bodies. Some men died instantly, their bodies unmarked, but their insides destroyed by overpressure. Others suffocated slowly in pockets of carbon monoxide, their final hours spent in absolute darkness, knowing no one would reach them in time. 73 miners are never recovered, their bodies entombed forever in collapsed tunnels sealed by thousands of tons of rock. This is not an accident. This is industrial murder perfected through decades of calculated negligence, on a disaster so predictable that engineers had mapped its inevitability in technical reports filed and ignored for years. Coal mining in Manchuria begins not as Chinese enterprise but as Japanese colonial extraction. When Japan invades Manchuria in 1931 and establishes the puppet state of Manchukuo, the Bengzi region becomes a focal point of imperial resource plunder. The South Manchuria Railway Company, operating as both transportation monopoly and mining conglomerate, takes control of coal deposits estimated at 800 million tons. Production quotas are not set by geological safety limits, but by Tokyo's war machine demands. By 1937, Japan's full-scale invasion of China requires exponentially increasing coal shipments for steel production, for naval fuel conversion, for powering the industrial infrastructure of total war. Bengzi coal mine, already operational since 1905 under Qing dynasty concessions, undergoes rapid expansion. Shafts are sunk deeper. Tunnels branch into increasingly unstable geological formations. The workforce swells from 4,000 miners in 1935 to over 17,000 by 1942, many of them Chinese laborers working under conditions that blur the line between employment and enslavement. 12-hour shifts are standard. Safety equipment is considered an unnecessary expense. Ventilation systems designed for 8,000 workers now service double that number, pumping insufficient fresh air into galleries where coal dust accumulates like black snow on every surface. If you value understanding how economic systems prioritize profit over human life, subscribe now. This channel documents the industrial disasters that corporations prefer you forget. The mine's profitability soars. Between 1938 and 1942, Bengzi produces 37 million tons of coal, generating revenues that fund military campaigns across the Pacific Theater. But every ton extracted deepens the powder keg growing beneath the surface. Engineers at the South Manchuria Railway Company understand the danger perfectly. Internal memos from 1940 describe coal dust concentrations at critical detonation thresholds. These documents recommend immediate production slowdowns and comprehensive ventilation upgrades. The recommendations are filed, never implemented, because implementation would reduce output by 30%. The war economy cannot tolerate such losses. So the mining continues, faster and deeper, while 312 men work their final shifts, entirely unaware that corporate accountants have already calculated their lives as acceptable costs. Coal dust behaves nothing like solid coal. When miners drill into seams, explosives fracture the rock, pneumatic picks tear chunks free, and conveyor systems transport the ore towards surface processing. Each operation generates pulverized particles measuring 10 to 400 microns in diameter. These microscopic fragments remain suspended in air for hours, coating tunnel walls, accumulating in ventilation ducts, settling in layers across floors and ceiling supports. A single cubic meter of air in an active coal mine can contain 300 grams of suspended dust, creating an atmosphere that miners describe as breathing fog. This dust is not inert. Coal is fossilized organic matter, rich in carbon, inherently combustible. In particle form, its surface area increases exponentially. A kilogram of coal dust presents the same reactive surface as a football field. When ignited, coal dust does not burn. It explodes. The combustion reaction occurs so rapidly that it generates shock waves, and those shock waves disturb settled dust layers, suspending them instantaneously into explosive clouds that ignite in cascade effects. This phenomenon, called a dust explosion, had been studied scientifically since the 1850s. By 1942, mining engineers understand the precise conditions required for catastrophic ignition. Dust concentrations above 50 grams per cubic meter, an ignition source exceeding 600 degrees Celsius, and confined spaces that allow pressure buildup. Banksy Mine in April 1942 meets all three conditions simultaneously across 17 kilometers of active tunnels. All ventilation protocols require maintaining air movement velocities above 1.5 meters per second to prevent dust accumulation. Banksy's actual ventilation rate, as measured in a March 1942 inspection, averages 0.7 meters per second in primary galleries and near zero in abandoned side tunnels that remain connected to active workings. Electrical equipment installed throughout the mine, motors, switches, lamps, generates sparks routinely, each one a potential ignition source. Safety regulations mandate explosion-proof housings for all electrical components. Banksy uses standard industrial equipment, naked sparking motors mounted directly onto coal dust-covered walls, because explosion-proof alternatives cost 3 times as much and require special ordering from Germany, delaying installation by months. What makes coal dust truly insidious is its invisibility to those who work within it daily. Miners at Banksy breathe dust concentrations that blacken their spit within an hour of entering the tunnels. They emerge from shifts with their faces masked in carbon, except for the outlines where goggles sat. They cough black phlegm for decades after leaving mine work, their lungs permanently scarred by pneumoconiosis, the disease that miners simply call black lung. But dust levels that destroy human respiratory systems are still far below explosive thresholds. A miner can work his entire shift in air containing 30 grams per cubic meter, enough to guarantee lung disease within 5 years, yet still be below the 50-gram threshold where the entire tunnel becomes a bomb waiting for ignition. This gap between chronic danger and acute catastrophe creates fatal complacency. Men who breathe poison daily begin to see it as normal, failing to recognize when conditions cross from merely lethal to catastrophically explosive. Warnings arrive repeatedly, each one more urgent than the last. In November 1940, a dust flash ignites in Gallery 7, a brief explosion that travels 40 meters before exhausting its fuel, killing 3 miners and injuring 12. The incident report, written by a Japanese safety inspector named Takahashi Kenji, concludes with stark clarity. Current dust management practices guarantee a major explosion within 18 months if corrective action is not implemented immediately. Drop a comment below. Have you or your family members worked in dangerous industrial conditions where management ignored obvious hazards? Share your story. These testimonies preserve history that corporations try to erase. Mine management responds by installing water spray systems in Gallery 7 only, leaving 16 kilometers of tunnels untreated. In June 1941, another flash explosion in Gallery 12 kills 2 miners. This time, management's response is to reclassify the incident as a methane ignition, avoiding the dust explosion designation that would trigger mandatory production shutdowns. By early 1942, Bengtsy's own internal logs record 17 separate minor dust events, the euphemism used to describe explosions that killed fewer than 5 men. Each event follows the same pattern: a sudden flash, a concussive blast, men found dead with their bodies intact, but their insides pulverized. Each time, production continues without interruption, because stopping the mine for comprehensive safety overhauls would cost the South Manchuria Railway Company an estimated 740,000 yen per week, a loss deemed unacceptable regardless of human cost. Bengtsy's disaster does not occur in a vacuum of ignorance. Coal dust explosions have killed miners by the thousands across every industrialized nation for a century before 1942. In 1906, the Courrières mine disaster in France kills 1,099 miners when coal dust ignites and propagates through 110 kilometers of tunnels, the deadliest mining disaster in European history. French investigators established definitive proof that dust suppression through water spraying and rock dusting can prevent explosion propagation. The technology is simple. Spray water mist to keep dust settled, or spread inert limestone powder to dilute combustible coal particles. Both methods cost less than 2% of annual mining revenues. In 1913, the Sengenid colliery explosion in Wales kills 439 men, again through coal dust detonation. British mine safety regulations are reformed, mandating strict dust control. By 1920, dust explosions in British coal mines decline by 90%. In 1924, the Bengtsyhu colliery explosion, at the same Bengtsy location, kills 1,549 miners in what remains the deadliest mining disaster in recorded history. This earlier catastrophe, occurring under different management but in the same geological formation, demonstrates conclusively that Bengtsy's tunnels are uniquely prone to dust accumulation and explosive propagation. Post-disaster analysis in 1924 recommends permanent ventilation upgrades and continuous water spraying. These systems are installed partially and then allowed to deteriorate as production pressures mount through the 1930s. The pattern is consistent across continents and decades. Disaster occurs. Investigators identify dust management failures, recommendations are made, costs are calculated, implementations are delayed, and production priorities override safety until the next explosion repeats the cycle. Japanese mining engineers in 1942 Manchuria are not ignorant of this history. They are choosing to ignore it. Internal communications obtained decades later through historical archives reveal explicit discussions about acceptable risk levels and probability calculations that weigh production quotas against statistical likelihood of catastrophic explosions. One memo dated March 12th 1942, just 6 weeks before the disaster, calculates that comprehensive dust suppression would reduce annual profits by 1.2 million yen, while the estimated compensation costs for a major explosion are projected at only 400,000 yen, making safety upgrades economically unjustifiable. This is not negligence born of ignorance. This is calculated risk assessment that places human life on a balance sheet and finds it cheaper to let miners die than to install water sprays. The city of Bengzi exists because of coal. Its neighborhoods radiate outward from mine shaft entrances like spokes from a wheel. Worker housing, cramped wooden structures built in dense rows, sits within 300 meters of the main extraction facility. When miners descend for their shifts at 6 a.m., their families watch from doorways. Children play in courtyards where coal dust settles like black frost on laundry hung to dry. Women scrub uniforms that never come fully clean, the fabric permanently stained by the substance that employs their husbands and slowly kills them. By 1942, 3 generations of families have worked Bengzi's tunnels. Grandfathers with lungs destroyed by decades underground train, grandsons just entering the workforce. Mining is not a career choice here. It is inherited inevitability, economic reality in a region where no alternative employment exists for working-class Chinese laborers under Japanese occupation. The South Manchuria Railway Company operates as a total institution, controlling not just employment but housing, food distribution, medical care, and even elementary education. Miners live in company housing. Buy food from company stores using company scrip and send their children to company schools where textbooks teach loyalty to the Manchukuo puppet state. Attempting to leave company employment means forfeiting housing immediately, a family-destroying prospect during wartime when alternative shelter is nearly impossible to secure. This economic captivity ensures a compliant workforce that accepts dangerous conditions because the alternative is homelessness and starvation. When safety concerns are raised, and they are repeatedly by Chinese workers who understand intimately the deteriorating tunnel conditions, management responds with threats, complain about danger and lose your job, lose your housing, lose your family's survival. On the morning of April 26, 1942, 312 men kiss their families goodbye and descend into tunnels they know are death traps because they have no choice, because the system has engineered their desperation so completely that risking certain death underground seems preferable to the certain starvation that awaits jobless families above. This is the hidden toll of industrial disasters, not just the men who die instantly in explosions, but the families trapped in economic systems that commodify their fathers, husbands, and sons, that calculate their lives in yen and tonnage and acceptable losses. The ignition source is never definitively identified, but forensic analysis conducted decades later points to Gallery 9, Section K, where a coal-cutting machine operates throughout the afternoon shift. At 3:27 p.m. and approximately 14 seconds, the machine's electric motor, a standard industrial unit without explosion-proof housing, generates a spark during routine operation. This happens dozens of times per shift normally, each spark dissipating harmlessly. But on this particular afternoon, at this particular moment, local air monitoring would have shown dust concentrations at 63 grams per cubic meter, sustained by stagnant ventilation and 4 hours of continuous cutting operations that have suspended massive quantities of fresh particles into the atmosphere. The spark finds its fuel. The initial ignition is a flash, a fraction of a second, where a sphere of combusting dust expands at 400 meters per second. This primary explosion is small, perhaps 10 cubic meters of air involved, But the shock wave it generates is devastating. Overpressure of 20 pounds per square inch radiates outward. In a concussive force 5 times greater than what human bodies can withstand. Miners within 50 meters of the ignition point die instantly, their deaths so rapid that their bodies barely react. No defensive wounds, no struggle, just sudden cessation as brains are liquefied by the pressure wave passing through skulls. But the primary explosion is merely the trigger. The shock wave disturbs dust settled on every surface within 200 meters, dust that has accumulated on tunnel walls, on ceiling timbers, on equipment and rails and support beams. Thousands of kilograms of this settled dust are instantaneously suspended into the air, creating an expanding cloud of explosive fuel. This secondary cloud ignites within microseconds, detonating in a vastly larger explosion that propagates down tunnels like a liquid fire, following ventilation pathways, seeking oxygen, consuming everything. The blast wave accelerates to supersonic speeds in confined tunnels, generating overpressures that collapse support structures. Timbers implode, steel I-beams buckle. Entire sections of tunnel pancake downward as thousands of tons of overburdened rock lose their artificial support and obey gravity. Men attempting to flee are overtaken by the shock wave. Some are thrown against walls with such force that their bodies leave impact impressions in coal seams. The explosion propagates through Gallery 9 entirely, then jumps ventilation connections into Galleries 7, 8, and 11. Each new gallery contains its own accumulated dust. Each one detonates in sequence, creating a cascading chain reaction that within 90 seconds has engulfed 17 kilometers of active workings. The sound at the surface is described by witnesses as a muffled roar, followed by a deep, subsonic rumble that rattles windows 3 kilometers away. Ventilation shafts belch columns of black smoke and flame 40 meters into the afternoon sky. The main elevator shaft becomes a chimney, ejecting superheated gases that incinerate the wooden headframe. Within 5 minutes, every underground connection to the surface is either collapsed or choked with toxic fumes. Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, and pulverized coal dust that hangs in the air like a black blizzard, making rescue attempts immediately impossible. The explosion's kill zone is not confined to the initial blast radius. And men working in galleries that remain structurally intact after the explosion find themselves trapped in a different horror. Slow suffocation in tunnels where oxygen has been consumed by combustion and replaced with carbon monoxide. CO is odorless, invisible, and insidious. At concentrations of just 0.4%, it causes unconsciousness within 3 minutes and death within 13. Throughout the deeper galleries, pockets of miners survive the initial explosion only to realize that every escape route has collapsed. They retreat into dead-end tunnels, desperate to find pockets of breathable air, scratching messages into coal walls with picks, messages that rescue teams will find days later. Trapped in Gallery 11 East, 17 men. Air failing. Tell our families we tried. Some groups attempt to dig through collapse zones, a futile effort when hundreds of tons of rock block passages. Others sit in darkness, conserving oxygen by minimizing movement, knowing rationally that no rescue will reach them in time, but unable to abandon hope until the very end. Their deaths are slow, agonizing progressions from consciousness to delirium, to unconsciousness, to cessation. When rescue teams finally reach these sealed galleries 4 days later, they find bodies arranged in patterns that tell stories. Men gathered in circles, holding hands in final moments, or positioned near tunnel walls where they scratched farewell messages until strength failed. The surface damage extends far beyond the mine itself. The explosion vents through ventilation shafts with such force that it blows apart surface structures within 100 meters. The main head frame collapses, and killing 3 surface workers who were operating the elevator mechanism. Shock waves propagate through underground geological structures, triggering subsidence that collapses buildings in the worker housing district. 17 residential structures, home to 64 families, suffer severe damage, with 3 buildings collapsing entirely, killing 11 people, including 5 children who were playing in courtyards when the ground beneath them gave way. The explosion also ruptures underground water barriers, flooding sealed galleries and entombing miners whose bodies will never be recovered. The total death toll reaches 312 confirmed dead, with 73 still missing and presumed dead, but these numbers reflect only immediate victims. In subsequent months, 47 rescue workers and miners attempting to reopen the tunnels die from secondary collapses, toxic gas pockets, and injuries sustained during recovery operations. The true human cost, when accounting for these secondary deaths and the families destroyed by lost breadwinners, approaches 400 lives shattered by a single preventable industrial disaster. The official death toll is announced as 312 confirmed dead, 73 missing presumed dead. These numbers are precise but antiseptic, offering no sense of the human devastation they represent. Behind each number stands a family destroyed. The youngest victim is 15 years old, a boy named Wei Jianhua, who had entered mine work just 3 months earlier, following his father into the tunnels because the family needed his wages to survive. He dies in Gallery 7, his body found next to his father's, their hands clasped together in final moments. The oldest victim is 61, a grandfather named Chen Guoqing, who had worked Banksy's tunnels for 43 years, training 2 generations of miners, his lungs already destroyed by decades of dust exposure. His body found 800 meters from the explosion's origin point, suffocated by carbon monoxide while attempting to lead younger miners toward a sealed escape route. The disaster orphans 127 children. It creates 83 widows, many of them in their 20s and 30s, now solely responsible for feeding families in an economy that offers women almost no employment opportunities. The South Manchuria Railway Company provides compensation, 200 yen per deceased miner, a sum equivalent to approximately 4 months' wages. This compensation comes with a requirement. Families must sign documents absolving the company of all liability and agreeing never to speak publicly about the disaster or its causes. Those who refuse to sign receive nothing. Most sign because starvation is not a theoretical threat, but an immediate reality. Memorial services are held, but they are controlled, sanitized affairs. The Manchukuo puppet government issues a statement describing the disaster as an unfortunate accident, an unavoidable tragedy inherent to the noble work of coal extraction that powers our industrial development. This framing is deliberate propaganda designed to obscure the negligence and calculated risk-taking that created the disaster. Chinese workers and their families know better. But speaking truth under Japanese occupation invites arrest. And so grief is swallowed, rage is suppressed, and 312 men are buried while their killers face no consequences. The bodies recovered from the deep galleries are often unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition, crushed by collapsed rock, or so decomposed after days in toxic atmospheres that features are unrecognizable. Mass graves are dug. Groups of unidentified miners are buried together in trenches. Some families never learn whether their missing husband or father was among those recovered or remains entombed in sealed tunnels. This uncertainty becomes its own torture. The inability to perform proper funerals, the impossibility of closure, the lifelong wondering whether somewhere deep beneath the earth, in absolute darkness, a body still lies where it fell. The investigation begins immediately, not to establish accountability, but to construct a narrative that protects corporate interests. The South Manchuria Railway Company appoints its own internal review board, a panel of company engineers who report directly to executives whose bonuses depend on maintaining production. This board's findings, released 6 weeks after the disaster, conclude that the explosion resulted from unpredictable geological conditions and an unforeseeable accumulation of circumstances beyond reasonable human control. The report describes the disaster as an act of God, a phrase that appears 17 times in the 30-page document, always in contexts that deflect blame from management decisions. Specific findings are illuminating in their evasions. The report acknowledges that dust concentrations exceeded safe thresholds, but attributes this to unexpectedly poor ventilation performance rather than to management's deliberate understaffing of ventilation maintenance and refusal to upgrade systems. The report confirms that electrical equipment lacked explosion-proof housing, but describes this as standard industry practice, without mentioning that such practice had been abandoned as recklessly dangerous in Europe and America 2 decades earlier. The report notes previous warnings from safety inspectors, but characterizes these as overly cautious recommendations based on theoretical rather than practical risk assessment. What industrial disasters from your country's history have been covered up or misrepresented by corporate investigations? Comment below. Collective memory is how we prevent these atrocities from being repeated. No criminal charges are filed, no company executives face consequences. The review board recommends enhanced monitoring and improved ventilation maintenance, recommendations so vague and unenforceable that they require no actual changes to operations. Within 3 months of the disaster, Benxi coal mine resumes full production, operating in the same galleries where hundreds died, using the same inadequate ventilation systems, or employing the same unsafe electrical equipment. The only substantial change is the installation of additional dust monitoring sensors whose readings are recorded but never acted upon, whose warnings are documented and filed and ignored, creating a paper trail of awareness that somehow generates no protective action. Japanese defeat in 1945 and the subsequent Chinese Civil War bury the disaster in historical chaos. When the People's Republic of China takes control of Manchuria in 1949, Benxi becomes a state-operated mine, but no revisiting of the 1942 disaster occurs. Both the communist government and the previously occupying Japanese power have incentives to forget an incident that reflects poorly on industrial management under both systems. The disaster remains largely unknown outside Benxi itself, a localized tragedy that escapes international attention because it occurs during wartime chaos and because both the perpetrators and successors prefer silence to accountability. The Benxi disaster is not an anomaly. It is industrial capitalism functioning exactly as designed when profit maximization overrides human safety. Every decision that led to 312 deaths was made rationally according to the internal logic of corporate cost-benefit analysis. Installing comprehensive dust suppression systems would have cost 1.2 million yen and reduced annual production by 30%. Allowing miners to die cost 400,000 yen in compensation and reduced production, not at all once operations resumed. From a purely economic perspective, the perspective that governed corporate decision-making, allowing the disaster to occur was the profitable choice. This calculus repeats across industries and centuries. Corporations operate under fiduciary obligation to maximize shareholder returns. Safety improvements that reduce profitability are therefore breaches of fiduciary duty unless legally mandated. This creates a perverse incentive structure where companies rationally resist safety regulations, lobby against enforcement, and implement protections only when the cost of non-compliance, through fines, lawsuits, or criminal penalties, exceeds the cost of compliance. In 1942, Manchuria, under Japanese occupation, virtually no enforcement mechanisms existed. The South Manchuria Railway Company operated as a semi-governmental entity, immune to prosecution, answerable only to military leadership whose priorities were maximizing resource extraction for war efforts. Workers had no unions, no legal recourse, no political power. This power asymmetry allowed management to impose conditions that workers understood as deadly while facing no consequences for doing so. The aftermath of Banksy demonstrates the system's self-perpetuating nature. No executives face prosecution, no regulations change. The company's stock value barely fluctuates. Investors understand that industrial disasters are priced into mining operations as predictable costs. Within a year, the disaster is forgotten by everyone except the families of the dead, who lack the social power to demand accountability. This amnesia is not accidental. It is cultivated through controlled investigations, sanitized reporting, and the natural human tendency to move attention toward new crises. But forgetting is what allows recurrence. When disasters vanish from collective memory, the lessons they could teach vanish too. Engineers in future mines do not study Banksy's failures. Regulators do not cite it as justification for stricter enforcement. Workers do not know their predecessors died from preventable negligence, so they cannot recognize when identical negligence threatens them. The pattern repeats, not because humanity fails to learn, but because corporations and governments actively invest in ensuring that learning does not occur, that each disaster is treated as an isolated incident rather than as a symptom of systemic priorities that value capital accumulation over human life. The Banksy coal mine disaster of 1942 changed almost nothing. No international safety standards were revised. No mining practices were reformed. The disaster occurred during wartime chaos, and under military occupation in a region that would change governments twice in the following 7 years, creating perfect conditions for historical erasure. Today, most people, even within China, have never heard of the 312 miners who died on April 26, 1942. There is no prominent memorial, no annual remembrance, no museum documenting what happened and why. The mine itself continued operations under Communist Chinese management until 2003, when declining coal reserves and modernization finally closed the tunnels where hundreds once died. A small monument exists near the old mine entrance, a stone marker with names of the dead erected by survivors' families in 1985, maintained by descendants who refuse to let their grandfathers become footnotes. But this memorial draws few visitors, and the disaster remains largely unknown even among industrial safety professionals who study mining catastrophes. Yet Banksy's lessons remain urgent and applicable. The economic incentives that killed 312 miners in 1942 still govern industrial decision-making in 2026. Corporations still perform cost-benefit analyses that weigh human lives against profit margins. Workers still face termination for raising safety concerns. Regulators still face political pressure to soften enforcement. The specific hazard may change. Coal dust in 1942, chemical leaks today, algorithmic management systems tomorrow, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Those who profit from dangerous operations are insulated from the consequences of those dangers, while those who face the dangers have no power to eliminate them. If this documentary has helped you understand how industrial systems prioritize profit over human life, please subscribe and share this video. Corporations rely on our collective amnesia. Channels like this exist to make sure that the dead are not forgotten and their lessons are not erased. The Banksy disaster teaches that safety does not result from technological advancement or increased knowledge. Engineers in 1942 understood perfectly how to prevent coal dust explosions. Safety results from power, the power of workers to refuse dangerous conditions without facing starvation, the power of regulators to impose penalties that exceed the cost of compliance, the power of communities to hold corporations criminally accountable for negligence. Where these powers exist, disasters decline. Where they are absent, miners die predictably and repeatedly, while management calculates the savings. On April 26th each year, in a small cemetery on Banksy's outskirts, elderly residents gather at the 1985 monument. They are the children and grandchildren of the 312 men who descended into tunnels that morning and never returned. They light incense, they bow, they speak the names of the dead. This ritual is not performed for the deceased. It is performed for the living, a reminder that every industrial disaster represents a choice, that 312 men did not die in an accident but were killed by decisions that valued coal production above human life, that remembering how they died is the only defense against ensuring others die the same way. The earth at Banksy has long since settled over the sealed tunnels where 73 bodies remain entombed, and the dust has settled in abandoned galleries where once it hung explosive in the air. But the lesson has not settled, cannot settle, must not settle, because somewhere today in a mine or factory or warehouse, workers are entering conditions they know are dangerous, conditions that management knows are dangerous, conditions that exist because someone has calculated that their lives cost less than the safety measures that would protect them. Banksy is not history. Banksy is present tense, ongoing, waiting to repeat wherever we allow economic incentives to override human survival. The 312 miners who died did not come home. Their absence asks a question we must answer with every industrial decision we make, every regulation we enforce or ignore. Why, every time we choose between profit and survival, how many more must die before we decide that no coal, no profit, no production quota is worth even a single human life?